life of Grondal is a great example of the immigrant experience in central Kansas. He spent his life traveling the globe before settling with his fellow Swedes in Lindsborg, Kansas. He documented the early life of the first Swedish settlement in the Smoky Valley. Grondal's photography captured and preserved much of the early buildings, people, and names that are still known in the community. Grondal's photos and memories live on in his photography studio that is still in Lindsborg today as a symbol of where we as Lindsborg came from. Born in Västerås, Sweden, Grondal lived many of his formative years in Västerås, attending the university's Latin school for boys at 11. His education was put first as a young man. He remained in school until he was 16. After leaving school, he set his sights on something he viewed as more important. He enlisted in the Swedish Navy at the young age of 16. After leaving, he would convince his family to emigrate to the United States. When Grondal arrived in the U.S., he used his experience in the Navy to gain employment on merchant ships around the U.S. On these different ships, he would sail up and down the Americas, back to Europe, through the Mediterranean, and eventually to the Horn of Africa. He spent many years on the ocean in this career. He would sail until nearly losing his life in a shipwreck in the Gulf of Mexico. This wreck would see him floating back to shore on a bale, ending his sailing career and starting his travels up the Mississippi and his road to capturing the images of the early Smoky Valley. Upon leaving the sea, he traveled up the Mississippi River where he would take odd jobs to make ends meet until he made it to Chicago. While in Chicago, he was a grocery salesman for 5 years, while also taking up the study of photography. He started his hobby while living in a rooming house with other young Swedes. His time in Chicago would sadly end with the burning of the home and the loss of all his possessions. After Grondal left Chicago, he found further employment in St. Paul, Minnesota. He would continue his study of photography and work under one of the resident masters in the city, Alfred Palmquist, learning the ins and outs of photography from his new employer. Grondal would eventually grow tired of the cold weather in the northern U.S., before traveling back south into Texas. For 4 years, he would have his own studios in different cities in Texas, until 1887. In 1887, Grondal met Carl Swenson, a fellow Swede who convinced him to move back north into the Smoky Valley of Kansas with other Swedes. 1887 would finally see Grondal moving to the Smoky Valley and starting his documenting and photography of the future city of Lindsborg, Kansas. Many of his photographs would include the first municipal buildings of the county and the start of Main Street. He would photograph many of the festivals and families. He photographed the early days of Bethany College and its first classes and recitals. Grondal would spend his life meticulously photographing many things around Bethany College and Lindsborg. He would take photos of Lindsborg until his death in 1945. Grondal's photos document and show many of the events into 1945, including the Messiah festivals. His photos also show the community built around Lindsborg and its people. Many of the festivals and funerals of men like Carl Swenson are also recorded in his archives. His photos contain many things that no longer exist around Lindsborg, like photos of signs and buildings from Bethany, including Old Main and what the college looked like before the town grew up around it. Grondal's passion for photography illustrates how much has changed about the immigrant experience in the central Kansas area. Where Lindsborg's rich history is captured is how these immigrants grew up. These immigrants kept close, supported each other, while planting the seeds for a larger tradition like the performance of Handel's Messiah. Since the very first performance in Dublin, Ireland, the longest-running performance of the Messiah is held in Lindsborg now. A 140-year tradition he only began photographing 5 years in. Each photograph tells more and more about how this community grew to what it is now. Grondal's life exemplifies the immigration experience of Swedish peoples to central Kansas. He dealt with many problems in his life, from shipwrecks to fires and lost property, before finding his eventual home and community in the Smoky Valley. There, he would spend more than 30 years in his photography shop building and documenting Lindsborg, Bethany, and the Messiah until his death. Our ability to envision Lindsborg's past today is thanks, in large part, to Grondal's discerning eye.